My name is Fiona Marin, and on April 9, 2013, the ordinary hum of my life as a critical care respiratory therapist in Savannah was torn open like thin paper the night a drunk driver broadsided my sedan on the Bay Street overpass. Metal shrieked, glass sprayed, and my last earthy sensation was the bitter copper of blood flooding my mouth while my chest crushed against the wheel. In the instant my heart flatlined, I rocketed out of my own body, weightless, into a silence so wide it felt like outer space. But then a warmth brighter than every ICU light I'd ever worked under surrounded me, and I knew I was standing before Jesus. He didn't hover. He stood eye level, robes moving as if stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel, gaze equal parts fierce and heartbreakingly tender. Without words he opened a window over the Atlantic, and the ocean itself rose like a living wall, higher than city skylines, stretching from Maine clear down past the Keys. I could taste its cold salt from miles away. Children's bicycles lay abandoned on boardwalks, gulls circled helplessly, and millions of souls in high-rises and beach cottages alike walked their kitchens unaware that time was about to rewind to Genesis-level chaos. "Warn them," he said, not booming, but resonant enough to pulse in my bones. "Because many will not recognize the hour until it towers over them." I wanted to ask how, why, when, but the vision slammed deeper. Train yards flooding like bathtubs, whole barriers of interstate ripped up like ribbon, Atlantic water foaming through canyons of glass where Wilmington's business district used to be. Even from the height of heaven I could hear mothers screaming their children's names. Chelsea, Mateo, Brielle. Voices that shredded me worse than any steering column. I tried to tear my eyes away, but his hand rested on my shoulder, holding me steady as if to say, see it all, feel it all, because they need the urgency that is crushing you now. Suddenly I was back in my body, searing pain rocketing through my sternum as EMTs wrestled me from the wreckage. But the real agony was knowing I'd just watched a clock begin to tick for the entire eastern seaboard. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and melted plastic from suction canisters. Yet the vision pressed louder than the monitors screeching my vitals. My husband, Ethan, eyes rimmed red behind his contractor's dust-specked glasses, leaned over my bed clutching my fingers swollen with 4 lines, and I blurted before the morphine could fuzz the memory. "There's a wave coming, an impossible wave," Jesus showed me. Ethan's jaw tightened the way it does when he's wiring live circuits. Steady on the outside, voltage ripping inside. He glanced at the nurse, but I tugged his hand harder, describing boardwalk swallowed whole, a bronze statue of a Revolutionary soldier in Charleston tilting underwater, the Cape Hatteras lighthouse blinking uselessly as the dark crested above it. My sister Janelle, pediatric resident turned sudden theologian, whispered that maybe the prophecy was metaphorical. Debt, culture wars, whatever. But I shook my head so violently I reopened the stitches near my ear. This was water, Janelle. Actual salt water snapping streetlights like twigs. In the long weeks of rehab that followed, night after night I woke soaked in sweat, lungs gasping as if already half drowned, hearing the invisible roar of that ocean wall. I posted the warning online only to watch comment threads degrade into memes and insults. Friends at church nodded politely yet changed the subject to potlucks. Even Ethan, who loved me since high school marching band, started calling the episode my collision fever dream. But I couldn't unsee toddlers' sneakers floating in brackish soup or the way Jesus' eyes carried grief wide enough to swallow the very wave he showed me. Each dawn I found a new shoreline city on Google Earth. Virginia Beach, Atlantic City, Cocoa, and prayed over street grids until sunrise bled hot across my kitchen tiles. Some mornings I sensed him standing just behind me, urging, "Keep going, the message must outrun the water." 7 months later, a thin envelope arrived from a tiny church in St. Augustine that had stumbled across my blog post and begged me to speak. I drove down A1A in a borrowed minivan, fingers drumming the steering wheel as palmettos blurred past, every mile marker a countdown. In their stucco sanctuary of 40 folding chairs, I poured out the vision until my throat rasped, detailing commuters stuck on Route 1 as floodwater buckled asphalt, paramedics steering rescue boats between streetlights, and the hush that settles seconds before the wall hits, a silence so vast it mutes even gull cries. Elderly couples wept into tissue packets, teens stared wide-eyed clutching surfboards like useless shields, yet when the service dismissed, only a handful lingered to ask how to prepare. I urged them. Build communication trees, memorize inland evacuation routes, store enough water for neighbors, but above all, anchor hearts in Christ because plywood can splinter, but souls sealed in Him endure. Driving home under a bruised purple dusk, I fought despair that my voice was a paper airplane against a hurricane. That night I dreamed the wave again, except this time I was on Tybee Island watching tourists chase umbrellas while the horizon bulged upward like a giant shrugging. The moment water eclipsed the sun, I shouted warnings that came out as strangled bubbles. I jolted awake inhaling imaginary brine, and in the dark I realized the true terror. Not the drowning, but the deafness of a world scrolling past salvation on 5-inch screens. I dropped to my knees beside the bed, whispering, "Lord, teach me how to shout louder than the algorithm." Doors kept cracking open. Radio interviews at dawn, podcasts recorded in cluttered basements, a regional news spot that trimmed my testimony down to a 40-second soundbite sandwiched between sports scores and the weekend heat index. Still, tiny seeds took root. I got emails from fishermen in Bar Harbor who started plotting secondary harbors, single moms in Norfolk mapping babysitter chains, an entire prayer circle in Myrtle Beach fasting on Wednesdays for God's mercy over the coastline. Each story fanned the embers in my chest, yet shadows gathered too. Skeptics who mailed photoshopped memes of me surfing a cartoon tidal wave, a distant cousin calling to warn I was torching my professional credibility, even Janelle pleading that I'd scare our parents into early graves. One muggy August afternoon I stood on Folly Beach Pier, breeze lifting my scar-thick hair, and asked Jesus if obedience was worth the hemorrhage of every comfortable friendship. Thunder grumbled, the tide receded farther than I'd ever seen, and gulls screeched inland in panicked V-formations. Nature itself preaching the sermon no Sunday bulletin dared print. Knees trembled, but peace rooted deeper than marrow. I whispered, "Yes, I'll keep warning," and the clouds parted just enough for one spear of sunlight to hit the restless Atlantic. A silent amen. Friend, if these words quake the walls of your spirit, don't scroll away. Ask Jesus if He's tugging your sleeve, share this story with every soul you love, and subscribe so together we can sound the alarm before that standing ocean finally takes its step. The Georgia humidity hadn't yet lifted its wet hand from our porch screens when a call came in from Caleb Dunham, a mild-mannered meteorology adjunct at Temple University who'd watched my interview on public access at 3 a.m. while grading freshman quizzes on stratocumulus layers. He confessed he didn't believe in visions, only data, yet the way I described that wall of ocean kept prickling him like static. Caleb had spent months pulling bathymetric charts and seismic histories, noting a quiet but steady flexing of the Puerto Rico Trench and a swarm of deep-focused tremors rippling up the mid-Atlantic ridge, the kind that slide under the news cycle because they don't rattle dishes on land. He invited me to Philadelphia to speak with a handful of coastal risk researchers in a brick-walled seminar room that smelled of stale coffee and chalk dust. Standing there with my hospital-harvested limp and a folder of printouts I barely understood, I laid out the vision again, this time lingering on a detail I'd never spoken aloud. As the water towered, I'd seen cargo ships sucked backward, their propellers whistling in reverse, as if the ocean inhaled before it roared out. Caleb's face blanched. He clicked a slide showing computer models of a trench-triggered landslide that would first yank sea level seaward, then sling it shoreward in a supersurge. A physicist named Dr. Nia Hartwell whispered, "Holy God," under her breath. Not as profanity but as a prayer. The room fell so quiet I could hear fluorescent bulbs hum. They peppered me with questions: salinity smell, exact cloud cover, whether the sun sat east or west of the crest, and every answer braided eerily with their projections. When the session ended, Caleb walked me to the elevator and said, voice cracking, "Science can map the bullet's path, Fiona, but you're handing us the gunshot's timing." I rode 12 floors down feeling like Jonah after the whale spit him out. Half relieved, half terrified that even the learned now sensed the rumble of God's warning beneath their spreadsheets. 3 weeks later a lingering concussion migraine pinned me to the bathroom tiles, pupils pulsing like sirens. Ethan dialed 911, and somewhere between the kitchen linoleum and the ambulance bench my heart lost rhythm a second time, snatching me right back into that boundless golden hush. Jesus stood with his back to me, gazing toward the same Atlantic canvas, yet now the water glowed blood orange, reflecting wildfires that licked up from Florida's pine flats all the way to Jersey boardwalks. He turned, and the sorrow in his eyes felt heavier than gravity. "The land will burn before it drowns," he said, and images cascaded. News anchors sweating in parking lot studios because stations were evacuated, retired couples hosing roofs in vain, tourists sprinting through smoke fog only to meet a mile-high curtain of water. But piercing every scene was a quiet brigade. Ordinary believers in neon vests guiding evacuees to idling school buses, church kitchens ladling soup under flickering exit signs, kids singing hymns loud enough to steady trembling elders. When I slammed back into my body, a defibrillator pad singed my chest and the paramedic shouted, "Pulse is back!" The hospital ceiling tiles blurred, but one truth burned clear. The church wasn't just meant to warn, she was meant to be the lifeboat. From my recovery bed I began sketching a grassroots network, calling it Signal Fire. Pairing inland congregations with coastal ones, matching spare bedrooms to evacuation routes, generator lists to medical supply donors. At night I'd fall asleep to the rhythmic ping of emails. A youth pastor in Tallahassee offering his church bus. A widower in Asheville pledging 10 cots in his basement. A retired nurse in Raleigh volunteering triage skills. Each pledge felt like piling sandbags against the oncoming deluge. Faith stacked high where levees might crumble. Our own neighborhood didn't share that zeal. Folks on Seabrook Lane liked their Friday fish fries and SEC football, and talk of tsunamis felt as foreign as snow tires. One evening I hosted a block meeting with hurricane-laminated maps and Caleb's animated surge models looping on a projector. Only 7 chairs filled. 2 of them Ethan and Janelle. When I mentioned stocking life vests, a landscaper named Royce laughed that he'd rather buy more beer. My cheeks flushed, but Ethan squeezed my thigh beneath the fold-up table. A silent keep going. I gave every attendee a printout titled "If the Sirens Sound" that listed inland mile markers, no toll back roads, and a bolded reminder: grab neighbors who can't drive. Weeks passed with no sign anyone had read it, until Tropical Storm Marielle brushed the coast and sent waist-high water swirling through storm drains. At 3 a.m. Royce's panicked pounding rattled our door. His mother's oxygen machine had lost power. Ethan bolted upright, hauled our spare generator across the cul-de-sac, and watched tears streak Royce's muddy cheeks as the machine hummed back to life. The next morning, Royce stapled my siren's sheet on every mailbox. Sometimes the wave of change starts with puddles in the street. Still, Dread gnawed. Headlines buzzed about rising insurance bailouts, barrier island erosion, record sea surface temps outsizing any algorithm's forecast. I'd lie awake hearing that phantom roar and wonder how many souls would still be asleep when the Atlantic finally flexed. Summer bled into a sepia-toned October, and Signal Fire spreadsheet swelled past 10,000 contacts. Ministers, truckers, chefs, plumbers, all ready to move when the first quake struck. Yet media attention swirled elsewhere. Political scandals, market bubbles, viral dances. I boarded a propeller plane to Nova Scotia for a small ecumenical summit. Heart-pounding turbulence hard, because Jesus had nudged me north. The organizers tucked me between lectures on sustainable fishing and coastal heritage tourism. But when I spoke, the room shifted. Even the stage lights dimmed as if listening. I described shrimp boats dangling from hotel balconies, ferries deposited 5 blocks inland, families lighting candles on church pews half submerged in salt water. Tears traced down cheeks weathered by Atlantic gales. Afterward, an elderly Mi'kmaq woman pressed a hand-woven bracelet into my palm and whispered, "The sea likes to play gentle until it doesn't. We've kept stories older than your country telling the same thing." On the flight home I stared out the porthole at moonlit waves and realized prophecy isn't always brand new. Sometimes God stitches ancient warnings to modern tongues so no generation can claim ignorance. Landing back in Savannah, I switched on my phone to 50 Signal Fire alerts. A 7.4 tremor had just rocked the trench south of Puerto Rico. No tsunami buoy readings yet, but every contact along the eastern corridor was asking, "Is this it?" My thumb trembled above the screen, pulse matching the distant seabed's heave. I inhaled, remembered Jesus' fierce tender stare, and typed the message that would ripple faster than any siren. Stage 1. Move the plan. Ladies in Maryland woke kids from bunk beds. Pastors in Jacksonville unlocked supply closets. Families in Maine pointed caravans toward the Appalachians. By dawn, dashboards like fireflies lit the highways inland, and I felt a strange double peace. Fear for the coast, yes, but all that obedience had become an army no headline could ignore. The evacuation phoned across Signal Fire's web unfolded like a living psalm. Families loading heirloom quilts and dog-eared Bibles into minivans. Volunteer truckers hitching flatbeds of bottled water. High school seniors in bright orange vests waving traffic toward the Blue Ridge like human lighthouses. I steered our own battered SUV behind Ethan, who drove a church shuttle crammed with Royce's oxygen-dependent mother, 3 toddlers wearing mismatched floaties, and a cello balanced across seat backs like an awkward guardian angel. The 2-lane blacktop shimmered under sweltering sun, every milepost a silent drumbeat of the trench's aftershocks. Somewhere near Swainsboro the caravan halted at a railroad crossing, and the stillness felt eerie. Cicadas humming, diesel engines ticking, the kind of hush before a curtain lifts. I gripped the wheel as my chest tingled. A third time the veil thinned and Jesus stood on the tracks ahead, right where rusted rails met asphalt. His robes rippled as though caught in the same fevered breeze bending the Georgia pines. No words. Only his gaze flicking from me to the horizon where sky met invisible water, as if etching a final line I must never let blur. Then the crossing arms jerked upward, horns blared, and the caravan rolled on. My pulse pounded against my ribcage, but inside the dread blossomed a strange certainty. Every trembling breath we took in obedience was already counted and kept. By nightfall we reached a retreat center in the foothills. Its A-frame cabins built for youth camps now lantern-lit like a makeshift citadel. Volunteers strung extension cords from humming generators. Caleb set up a folding table disguised as a mini command post, laptop screens casting his face in flickering blue. Janelle triaged arrivals beside a campfire, her pediatric stethoscope shining like a badge of gentle authority. I roamed the gravel paths with spiral notebook in hand, logging medical needs, food allergies, the number of infants who would burn through diapers before dawn. Yet every conversation spiraled back to one question whispered behind cupped hands. Has the water come? Cell service sputtered, but scattered headlines dripped through. Buoy network registers sudden drop. Caribbean resorts evacuate after unusual tide retreats. In the dining hall a teenage girl sobbed into the sleeve of her oversized hoodie. She'd left her elderly cat behind when neighbors drove off without warning. I knelt, wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders, and felt the full weight of Jesus' earlier sorrow settle over us both. There would be uncountable losses, some as small as striped tabbies, others measured in entire zip codes, and our frail hearts had to hold them all. Just after 2 a.m., a lone radio crackled through static. Emergency frequencies out of Cape May reported sea level plunging nearly 8 feet in 10 minutes. Trawlers tipping onto sudden sandbars like toys. Caleb's knuckles whitened around his headset. He whispered, "The ocean's taking its inhale." A collective shudder rippled through the assembly hall. Grandfathers whispered prayers that wove Cherokee, Spanish, Gullah into one plea. Toddlers clung to parents' legs, and the air tasted metallic, the way hospitals smell right before a code blue. I stepped onto the flagstone patio where fog clung low over the valley, and for a heartbeat the dim outline of a surge towered in my mind's eye so viscerally I swore I heard sheet metal billboards crumpling miles away. Knees buckled, and the gravel bit through my jeans as I cried out, not in panic but in raw intercession, that every sleeping soul on the coast would jolt awake with just enough time to run. Somewhere behind me a worship chorus rose, shaky at first, then strong. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his name. Their harmonies wrapped the night like plywood on a storm window, sealing hope inside. Dawn cracked open with a crimson band smeared across distant ridges, the kind of blood-red sunrise sailors once called a warning. Reports flooded in chaotic bursts, Barrier Island webcams flashing only gray, Charleston's Market Street underwater past the second story. A freight train derailed near Wilmington after tracks were peeled away like foil by rushing backflow. Yet amid the catastrophe, testimonies glimmered, church bells in Beaufort ringing non-stop as refuges, a volunteer fire chief in Kitty Hawk using fishing skiffs to rescue stranded rooftop families, an anonymous pilot flying repeated circuits to relay radio messages after towers failed. Each miracle felt like a candle shoved into roaring wind, but together they drew constellations of mercy across a blackout sky. I scribbled every story in the margin of my notebook, pages fluttering as helicopters thumped overhead carrying the injured inland. And then, exhausted, I turned one last sheet and wrote 3 bold lines meant for every trembling heart within earshot and beyond. The wave came. The word still stands. Choose the rock, not the sand. I didn't know yet if that would be the final call to action, but I felt heaven lean close as ink dried, as if Jesus himself nodded approval. Because even when oceans rise, the fiercest tide a soul will ever face is the decision of whom to trust when ground disappears. We spent 3 long days in that mountain shelter with the news flickering in and out like an old porch bulb, and when the first report said the surge had finally flattened into swollen back bays, I felt a pull as strong as tide on anchor chain to drive back toward the wreckage the ocean left behind. Ethan argued I should rest. The bruises down my spine were still purple storms, but the same voice that once told me warn them now whispered go stand with them. We loaded the shuttle with crates of antibiotics, baby formula, and the little hand-crank radios Caleb had stashed for grid-down morale. The interstate south looked like a movie set after the extras went home. Lane markers hidden under muddy grit, guardrails ripped away, the smell of diesel mingled with rotting marsh grass. Near Walterboro the highway dipped and we rolled through brackish ponds that still held flopping mullet. Royce's mama laughed wetly at the fish thumping under our wheels. Sometimes grief gifts strange laughter. When Charleston's skyline finally showed, the Arthur Ravenel Bridge was draped in shipping containers like Christmas ornaments, and Fort Sumter's flagpole jutted from froth like a lone matchstick. I parked on Meeting Street where the waterline tattooed second-story shutters, and my knees buckled at the sight of shrimp boats impaled into storefronts where tourists once bought pralines. Yet amid the chaos I heard hymn fragments drifting from a gutted church. Inside, volunteers in yellow ponchos passed blankets through a human chain, their voices cracked but steady on "Great is thy faithfulness." The clash of broken glass, diesel pumps, and worship mixed into a single raw song, and I knew heaven heard every note. We worked till our palms blistered and our noses bled salt. Caleb mapped hot spots where elderly couples were stranded on rooftops. Janelle stitched lacerations by flashlight because generators coughed more fumes than power. Ethan waded chest deep to pry a kindergarten door off its hinges so we could turn the classroom into a triage bay. I spent most hours kneeling beside cots, holding hands slick with dried brine, listening to stories that echoed pieces of my own vision. A postal worker from Tybee who watched the ocean crawl backward then sprint forward like a beast. A nurse from Myrtle who saw cargo ships skidding across boulevard medians. A surfer who swore he felt an invisible hand shove him to high ground seconds before the crest smashed his board to splinters. Every tale braided into the warning Jesus had shown me, but each one also carried a spark of rescue. Neighbors dragging strangers through windows, teenagers forming bucket lines, an atheist who dropped to his knees mid-flood crying out for mercy he never believed existed. Under smoky sunset skies I scrawled names and miracles in my notebook until pages blistered with damp, and I realized that even disaster cannot drown the image of God stamped on human hearts. It only scrapes away the varnish so the imprint gleams raw and bright. On the 4th night exhaustion swallowed me. I lay against a pew plank propped in the shuttle and slipped into a sleep so heavy it felt like sinking. Suddenly I was weightless again, hovering above the scarred coastline. Jesus stood beside me on a strip of moonlit sand where ruined pier pilings jutted like broken teeth. His robe hem brushed the foamy edge, and he looked not at the wreckage but inland where tiny campfires dotted the dark like fireflies. "Do you see them?" he asked, voice softer than before yet fierce with hope. Each flame represented a story I had heard, the surfer, the postal worker, the atheist, and as he spoke, the fires spread up river valleys, over mountain crests, spilling west until the whole map glittered. "The water carved a valley in their pride," he said, "and now my spirit will river through it." I watched seedlings of revival sprouting in shelter tents, in FEMA lines, in gutted barbershops turned prayer rooms. Tears blurred my sight and I whispered, "How do we tend so many sparks?" He touched the notebook clutched to my chest and said, "Words are kindling, Fiona. Keep writing." In a blink I slammed back into waking, chest heaving, Ethan shaking my shoulder because dawn briefing was starting. My notebook lay open on my lap, a fresh page already filled with handwriting not my own. Tell them the flood was not the end but the invitation. My hands trembled, yet courage pooled warm as sunrise coffee. When power crews finally cleared a corridor to the undamaged uplands, signal fire began shuttling survivors inland by the thousands. I rode shotgun on the first convoy, live streaming patches of the journey whenever a cell tower flickered awake. Folks on the internet, safe in distant time zones, watched in stunned silence as we crawled past pickup trucks cemented in reef mud, school buses stacked like dominoes, oak roots ripped from centuries-old soil. I kept the camera steady but aimed my words past the lens and straight at every soul scrolling by. This is what prophetic mercy looks like when ignored, but it's also what human mercy looks like when embraced. Help us rebuild. Pray, give, come. Comments flooded faster than the river current we forded outside Yemisi. Some mocking, many weeping, more asking how to join signal fire teams. By the time we reached the foothill camp again, pallets of supplies were already stacked under blue tarps, shipped from churches in Idaho, Kentucky, and even a tiny house fellowship in Reykjavik. Caleb grinned, eyes rimmed red, whispering, "Data can't measure this." I stepped onto the mess hall porch, heart throbbing with gratitude and holy urgency, lifted that same scarred notebook, and began reading names of needs aloud. Wheelchairs, tetanus shots, counselors for kids who can't sleep. Volunteers scribbled, nodded, hustled away in every direction like bees launched from a hive. And I felt it, an undertow of hope stronger than any brute wall of water, the body of Christ in motion, proving to a battered world that when everything familiar buckles, the kingdom still stands, arms open like a harbor light, calling the storm-tossed home. 6 weeks drifted by like smoke over the tidal flats, and the calendar flipped to December before I realized I hadn't felt the ocean's phantom roar in my ears for days. Its absence both relief and eerie hush, like the silence after a verdict. Snow never sticks in Savannah, but a thin frost dusted the battered live oaks the morning Ethan and I rolled back toward the coast with a convoy of carpenters, drywallers, and volunteer trauma counselors. Whole neighborhoods looked like built-by kids' sandcastles after a bucket splash. Stubs of staircases leading to nowhere, refrigerators wedged in treetops, porch swings tangled in shrimp nets. Yet amid the wreckage, hope hammered steadily. Youth groups sashaying wheelbarrows of concrete, tattooed bikers hoisting roof trusses beside Mennonite farmers, a line of grandmothers ladling venison stew to anyone with an empty bowl. I spent each dawn scribbling names and miracles into my notebook until pen grooves bled through pages. A welder who forged crosses from twisted rebar and planted them at every block corner. A single mom who opened her gutted living room as a daycare so contractors could keep swinging hammers. A retired jazz pianist coaxing hymns from a water-warped upright salvaged off a church stage. One swamp-cold evening, as generators growled and the sky blushed peach over wrecked sailboats, I felt Jesus whisper, "The shoreline is scarred but the soil is softened. Plant now." So we sowed, backyard Bible studies under tarp roofs, pop-up counseling tents where surfers once rented boards, late-night prayer walks that traced tide-stained streets like veins. I watched grief turn its face toward grace the way sunflowers track dawn, and for the first time since the wreck that killed me, the vision of the wave didn't crush my lungs, it fueled them. Word of the grassroots revival traveled faster than FEMA paperwork, and by mid-January I found myself in a marble-floored anteroom outside a congressional subcommittee chamber in Washington, D.C., clutching the same battered notebook and wearing Ethan's best-pressed blazer over thrift store slacks that still smelled faintly of mildew. Lobbyists in silk ties sidestepped my muddy boots while aides rehearsed talking points about infrastructure resilience. But the moment my name echoed through that acoustically perfect hall, I felt the same bone-deep hush that had filled the ICU when my heart first stopped. Under chandeliers brighter than any operating room lamp, I recounted the vision to elected officials who shuffled briefing folders and checked phones yet could not entirely mask the flicker of terror when I described cargo ships reverse whistling before the surge. I cited Caleb's seismic data and Dr. Hartwell's models, but more than that, I told them about the atheist who'd clawed onto a church roof shouting, "Jesus, save us!" and has since spent every Saturday gutting moldy drywall for strangers. The chairman's gavel eventually cut my testimony short, citing time, but reporters mobbed me outside, microphones bristling like quills. I spoke until my voice rasped, repeating one line until traffic horns drowned me out. Prepared hearts save more lives than concrete walls. That night in a cheap hotel room smelling of overbleached sheets, I dreamed Jesus walking the Potomac at sunset, Capitol Dome behind him, his footprints filling with water that shimmered gold then drained away, leaving the marble dry, mercy tracing paths policy might ignore. Back home, spring arrived draped in wisteria and plywood-colored horizons. Signal fire had swollen into a nationwide lattice. Montana ranchers trucking hay for displaced horse owners, Alaskan fishermen mailing vacuum-sealed salmon slabs, a Navajo chapter sending handcrafted blankets dyed desert sunset red. Amid the bustle I felt a tug to gather the scattered embers into one blazing beacon, so we announced a sunrise worship gathering on the battered Folly Beach pier, what remained of it. Skeptics scoffed. No stage, no electricity, no guarantee the patched pilings would hold. But Easter morning broke over a purple Atlantic, and thousands trudged across sands still peppered with glass and shell shards, some barefoot, some in steel-toed boots, many weeping before the first chord strummed. Caleb rigged a battery amp off a solar array, the jazz pianist rolled his salvaged upright down the boardwalk on a borrowed forklift, and as the first hymn rose, dolphins breached just beyond the surfline, their backs glistening like living commas punctuating every lyric about resurrection. I stepped to the microphone, palms trembling, and read from my notebook the list of miracles inked since the water receded. Every nail driven, every meal shared, every heart that bent toward Jesus in the ruins. The crowd answered each line with a single word. Still. Families lost homes. Still. Jobs washed away. Still. Waves roared. Still. With each echo the word grew louder until gulls wheeled off in startled spirals and I felt the pier beneath us vibrate. Not with aftershock but with unified stubborn hope. By midsummer, seedlings of new life sprouted literal and spiritual. Sea oats greening back on reshaped dunes, church plants meeting in repurposed surf shops, house groups baptizing neighbors in fiberglass kiddie pools because sanctuaries were still studs and nails. I spent long evenings at folding tables translating notebook scrawl into training guides. How to turn a fellowship hall into a supply hub in under an hour, how to rig rain barrels to filter brackish floodwater, how to weave testimony into triage so bodies and souls mend together. One sticky July night the physicist, Dr. Hartwell, called breathless. Her team's models showed the trench had stabilized, pressure diffusing sideways toward open ocean. No second surge, she said. Not this generation, maybe not the next. Relief should have dropped me to my knees, yet a melancholy fluttered instead. The warning season was closing, and I wondered who I'd be without the drumbeat of imminent disaster. But then I heard Jesus' earlier promise echo, the flood was invitation, not finale, and realized the mission had only shifted from wake-up siren to rebuilding anthem. On a porch strung with citronella candles, I penned the first line of a new notebook. If mercy could tear down waves, imagine what it can build. And as katydids thrummed in the humid dark, I felt future chapters unfurl like blueprints. Counseling centers where surf schools once stood, retreat cabins for burnout first responders, a coast-to-coast network ready for the next crisis whether fire or quake or storm. The Atlantic murmured beyond mangled seawalls, less a threat now, more a wounded ally healing alongside us, and I whispered into the night. We're still here. So let's keep pouring living water where the salt once stung. Autumn slipped in wrapped in harvest gold leaves, and Signal Fire's map now stretched clear to the Pacific where wildfire chaplains wanted our blueprints for rapid response soul care. I boarded a westbound rail car with Ethan and a 6-member crew, our duffels stuffed with duct-taped manuals and jars of coastal sand we carried like holy relics. Through rattling windows I watched America blur, cotton fields surrendering to Ozark ridgelines, grain silos rising like steeples, while journaling every unlikely alliance sparked by the wave. Cajun shrimpers funding Yakama Nation smoke shelters, New Hampshire retirees quilting blankets for Guatemalan migrants in Arizona detention centers, a Mennonite grocer who tithed produce trucks to tornado towns. Each story confirmed what Jesus had shown that night on ruined pier pilings. Mercy floods faster than water when hearts break open. In Denver, a former atheist rescue diver cornered me backstage at a relief conference panel, tears shining as he admitted he'd watched my first trembling live stream and mocked it. Then weeks later found himself underwater off Charleston cutting free a teenage girl whose hoodie read, "Jesus loves you." He surfaced sobbing into his mask, the mocking washed out by brine and revelation. I pressed the battered bracelet the Mi'kmaq elder had given me into his palm, whispering, "Keep passing the story forward." By the time we reached Seattle, the notebook's spine was peeling and my wrist ached from chronicling mercy ripples. Yet the train whistle's long mourn reminded me of that first unseen siren from the trench, and I vowed every mile of quiet before the next disaster would be spent teaching people to hear God's whisper before he has to raise his voice with tectonic thunder. Returning east weeks later, I felt the Atlantic's pull like a tide in my marrow, so I detoured to Outer Banks where Barrier Island skeletons still jutted half-rebuilt against steely waves. Night fell cobalt, and I camped beside the Cape Hatteras lighthouse, its base now encircled by benches carved from storm-felled cedar, a prayer garden seated in salt-scarred soil. As I stared at Fresnel beams slicing mist, Jesus met me in a dream made of crashing surf and laughter. Children building castles on brand-new dunes, each taught mound crowned not with flags but with tiny cross sticks. He knelt beside one boy, tracing a trench around the castle's walls, and when the tide rushed, the water filled the moat yet spared the keep. Waking before dawn, I understood. He was sketching a parable of surrender. Carve space for living water and it will protect, not destroy. At sunrise I gathered islanders around still cracked pavement and taught them the trench prayer. A deliberate carving out of daily stillness where God's voice can pool. Fishermen in rubber boots, teachers hauling salt-spotted lesson plans, a tattoo artist clutching her sketchpad. They stood in semicircle scooping imaginary moats around their hearts, promising to let living water fill first so rogue waves skim the overflow rather than crush the core. I wrote the ritual into fresh manuals that evening, titling the chapter Dig First, Defend Later, and sensed Jesus' smile as gulls wheeled overhead like punctuation marks on the new coastline sermon. Winter rolled back again, 2 years since the surge, when a letter arrived on courthouse stationery informing me the drunk driver who'd shattered my sternum, Rodney Pierce, was petitioning for early release after exemplary prison behavior. Old trauma fluttered its vulture wings, yet I felt nudged to attend the hearing. Inside the minimalist courtroom, Rodney looked smaller than memory. Prison blues hanging loose, eyes haunted. When given opportunity to speak, he faced me trembling. "Ma'am, I wrecked your life, but the news says you saved thousands after your vision. I ask God nightly why he spared anyone through my sin." The judge glanced my way expecting protest, but the Spirit flooded me with that same mixed fierceness and tenderness I'd seen in Jesus' gaze, and I heard myself reply, "The wave was bigger than your mistake, and grace is bigger still. If freedom helps him serve the rebuilding, I stand in favor." Gasps rustled the gallery, the gavel rapped approval, and Rodney collapsed sobbing as though shackles had fallen mid-air. Later, outside under gray drizzle, he whispered that prison chaplains used my notebook stories as Bible study fuel. Inmates now pledged to join signal fire teams upon release. I walked away realizing forgiveness is its own tidal force, invisible but strong enough to move men from cages to caravan convoys. Proof that no aftershock of sin outruns redemption's surge. Early spring of the third year found us dedicating a coastal resilience center built atop the old ICU lot where my heart had flat-lined. We named it the Watchtower Clinic, its facade clad in reclaimed ship planks, windows angled like lighthouse panes, rooftop garden irrigated by rain harvest barrels. Janelle headed pediatric PTSD programs there, Caleb installed real-time seismic dashboards on the lobby wall, and Ethan wired solar arrays feeding an amphitheater where nightly we host stories by the sea. Survivors recounting miracles beside crackling driftwood fires. Opening day, the governor cut ribbon while drones streamed footage to classrooms nationwide. But that night we held smaller ceremony. Just volunteers circling the star-shaped courtyard, hands linked as I read from the original notebook now preserved in salt-sealed resin beneath the plaza tile. I finished with the Mi'kmaq bracelet verse etched into bronze. "When water forgets its borders, let mercy remember yours." Overhead, Orion tilted toward the horizon like a silent sentinel, and I felt peace settle deep, knowing the warning had blossomed into watchfulness, a living rhythm of prepare, rescue, rebuild, repeat until tides and time themselves bow to the one who first whispered, "Warn them." A fourth spring unrolled its green carpet across the weary coastline, and I found myself back on the same Bay Street overpass where a steering wheel once stopped my heart. The guardrail was replaced, the pothole patched, but skid marks still ghosted the asphalt like faint scars. I parked, stepped out, and let the humid wind press against my face while rush hour traffic hissed by in restless ribbons. With eyes closed, I replayed the two worlds that collided here. The physical crash that broke my bones and the tidal vision that broke my certainty life could ever be predictable again. I whispered thanks that Jesus met me in both collisions, then opened my battered notebook to its last clean page. Sirens wailed in the distance, ambulance or fire I couldn't tell, but instead of dread they stirred determination. Every rescue today was proof yesterday's warning mattered. I jotted new marching orders beneath those siren echoes. Keep drills fresh, keep hearts soft, keep watch. Just then my phone pinged with a signal fire alert. Rodney Pierce and a half-dozen ex-inmates had finished framing the final walls of a sorely needed daycare in Surfside. Children were already painting rainbows on the plywood. The overpass shimmered in late afternoon heat, and I realized mercy now traveled faster than any speeding car that once crushed me. It raced on texts and testimonies, not metal and gasoline. Late that summer we hosted the first coast-to-coast watch night, inviting believers from every time zone to keep a 24-hour relay of prayer and readiness workshops. Satellite feeds stitched together living room altars in Portland, cornfield sanctuaries in Iowa, reclaimed surfer shacks in St. Augustine, all projected onto a patchwork sail nailed between two palms on Folly Beach. When my hour to teach arrived, thunderheads bruised the horizon, and wind whipped salt through the crowd's hair, but nobody flinched. These were people who'd already learned storms can be pulpits. I spoke of trench prayers, of digging soul moats before crisis, of building relationships sturdy enough to ferry neighbors to safe ground. Halfway through, lightning forked the sky and the projector flickered out, so we lifted our phones high, flashlights on, and the beach instantly glittered like a galaxy. Thousands of tiny beams answering heaven's electricity with our own. I finished by shouting over the wind, when power grids fail, let's be the grid. When sirens die, let's be the shout. When waves rise, let's be the higher ground. Thunder applauded, and the crowd roared a single word that once kept us steady on splintered pier boards. Still. The next morning, before dawn pinked the clouds, I walked alone to the waterline with Ethan's arm warm around my shoulders. The Atlantic breathed gentle for once, little foamy sighs curling over my sneakers. Beside us, teenagers from the watch night buried a time capsule. Inside, copies of evacuation maps, kid-drawn prayers, wood shavings from the Watchtower Clinic, and a flash drive loaded with every live stream testimony to date. One girl pressed a note into my palm before they sealed the box. If someone digs this up after the next storm, tell them Jesus already started rebuilding. Tears burned my eyes, but joy rose higher. I thought back to the first vivid wall of water, the roar, the terror, and realized that even if another wave comes in my lifetime or a grandchild's, hearts are now braced like seawalls of living stone. I bent, scooped a palmful of cold salt water, and let it trickle through my fingers while whispering, "You only reach this far, the rest belongs to Him." In the hush that followed, I felt no fear, only commission. Friend, if this story has stirred even the smallest ripple inside you, don't let it ebb away. Ask Jesus right now where He wants you planted, on some front line of warning, on a rebuild crew, in a prayer trench carved quiet at dawn. Share this video with everyone you love who lives near any kind of coast, ocean, river, even the fragile shoreline of their own excuses. Hit subscribe so you walk with us as Signal Fire trains watchtowers worldwide. Comment below how you're prepping hearts and homes. We'll connect you to a network already in motion. And if you haven't yet stepped onto the rock that no flood can move, call on His name today. Before the sirens sound, before the ground gives way, while mercy's tide is still running strong in your direction. Warn, rebuild, and shine with us, starting right now.